approval. And people looked at me like I was totally and completely insane. And they said, A, we don't need Congress, and B, we won't get Congress, and therefore we're going to go ahead without the Congress. And the president made a speech announcing that NATO bombers would start bombing Serbia the next day, and they did. Now, you would think the Congress would be upset about this, but in fact, I think the principal thing to understand about members of Congress, very profound insight developed by a political scientist some years ago, is that they want to get reelected. And I remember once Senator Leahy explaining to us when we were talking about some vote on the Senate floor, he said, every member of the Senate, when they go to the floor, thinks to themselves, the 2-minute commercial which their opponent will make when they decide which way they're voting on this thing. So they think to themselves, if I vote yes, here's the ad they will make. And if they vote no, here's the ad they will make. And they decide which is more threatening to them, given their constituency. And while other things, including what they believe to be true, has some impact, that the dominant question is, could this cost me my reelection if I vote one way or the other? And votes about going to war have the characteristic where it's hard to know in advance which way will be evil. If the president says we must go to war, and Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and our security depends on going to war, and you vote no, and then he doesn't go to war, you get attacked for that. If you vote yes, and it turns out there are no weapons of mass destruction, and many people get killed, and the war is unpopular, you have to face that. So the best solution from the point of view of the Congress is not to have to vote. And if they have to vote, most of them end up thinking voting yes is better than voting no. Because if they vote yes, then they're supporting the president. And if the war goes wrong, they can blame it on the president. And we all saw speeches from senators, some running for president, explaining why their yes vote did not really mean they were for the war. Remember, one famous senator said he voted against the war before he voted for the war. But nevertheless, you can blame it on the president. If you vote no, and then the president decides not to go to war because you voted no, then you are blamed for the disaster which occurs. So Congress's view in general is we would prefer not to vote. In recent times they've been forced to vote, but over their objections. And indeed, this process dates from the Korean War. Up until the Korean War, I think most observers, most presidents, most members of Congress would have thought that the president does not take the nation into a conflict of that scale without Congress declaring war. And we had never in our history, there have been, as people will tell you, there have been 142 or 167, depending on how you count them, episodes in which the president used military force without the Congress. But never at the scale and duration that the Korean War was likely to be. And so when Truman gathered with his advisors, their first assumption was that if we were going to go to war, they had to go to the Congress and get a resolution. And Truman called in the members of Congress, and to his amazement, they all said, we think you should go to war. We think we have to fight this attack from the Sino-Soviet bloc, as we then thought it was, against a free country, which we thought any country that wasn't part of the Sino-Soviet bloc was quote free. We have to do this, but don't come to the Congress for a resolution because we're not sure we can pass it. In any case, it will be a grueling fight that we don't want to have. So you should just do this. And so they did. And that began the process coming from the Congress, not from the president, in which presidents have assumed they have the right to do this, and the Congress has conspired with them to do it. Now, the Vietnam War got so unpopular that they passed the War Powers Act. But the War Powers Act has enough loopholes in it so that every president has been able to decide what to do when he wants to do it. Every president has given notice to the Congress when he's used military force, but always with this wonderful phrase that said, this notice is consistent with the obligations in the War Powers Act. Meaning he's not doing it because he's obliged to by the War Powers Act, but it's consistent with what, if he thought the War Powers Act was constitutional, what he would be obliged to do, and he's doing it on his own, but not suggesting that he thinks the War Powers Act is constitutional. Every president that's been in office since the War Powers Act was constitutional, as was passed, has argued that it was unconstitutional, has indicated that he will not be bound by it, and has nevertheless tried to find a way to act consistent with the War Powers Act. But clearly it is not a solution to the problem. I think if there is any solution, it lies in trying to force a process of consultation rather than a process of requiring congressional approval. The proposal's been made by a number of people that suggest that Congress ought to create a committee which consists of the leadership, the ranking members of the Armed Services, Foreign Relations, now Intelligence, Appropriations Committees. And the President ought to be required to consult with that group if he is thinking about the use of military force to determine what form of consultation with the Congress is appropriate in this situation and how they should proceed with it. And out of that ought to come an agreed decision about how to move forward. I think that will have some good, but I want to end where I started, which is to say we have this problem because neither the Congress nor the President want to follow the Constitution, because the courts have been utterly, completely unwilling to enforce the Constitution, and because the argument about how we go to war, who decides about war, is inevitably mixed with the question of should we go to war, and that question tends to dominate the debate. Let me stop there, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
When you say the Pentagon is always against war, obviously a building can't make a decision. What people, what authorities in the Pentagon have that power?
I mean, that's true. When I worked in the Pentagon, I was in an office one day, and the secretary burst in and said to the guy I was meeting with, the White House is on the phone. And he looked up at her and he said, I never talk to buildings. Find out if there's a person calling.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. It is people. It is the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are always against going to war. And they're against going to war partly because they know how terrible war is, more than anybody else. And they're against going to war because it never is the right war. You know, we always want the military to fight in ways that they don't want to. What the military want to do is fight with divisions, with bombers and tactical fighter planes. The Marines want a place where you can storm ashore. The Navy wants to defend the seas. And all the wars we've had have been not like that at all. So the military were against the Korean War. In fact, when Truman called a meeting, and he was then living in Blair House because the White House was being reconstructed, to discuss what to do about the war, Secretary Johnson, who was the Secretary of Defense, came in, and Truman had flown back from Missouri with great turmoil, and Secretary Johnson reads a paper about the importance of Taiwan. And they have then a discussion, and the chiefs explain how hard it will be to defend Korea, how we don't really have any ready divisions, how all the forces stationed in Japan are not battle trained. They were sent there in a hurry to run the occupation, and it will be a disaster. And many people will be killed, and they can't guarantee to hold Korea. But they began with reading this paper on Taiwan, and when they left, Truman turned to Atchison and said, "What's going on here?" And Atchison said, "They've offered you a deal. If you will announce that we will defend Taiwan, they will support going into Korea." And so Truman did, and that's how we got to defend Taiwan. We were going to let Taiwan go. And so the whole history of U.S.-Chinese relations can only be understood by understanding that the chiefs did not want to go into Korea, and got the price of that being the defense of Taiwan. They were against the Berlin blockade. You know, remember, the Russians cut off access to Berlin, and Truman wanted to use the Air Force to fly in. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force came in and he said, the Air Force is not in the supply business. We are in the bombing business, and we do not want to use our airplanes to fly food into Berlin. That's not what we do. And Truman said, well, it is what you're going to do now.